Before we begin, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment if you think love can ever justify betrayal, because after this story, you might never look at forbidden love the same way again. It was just past 10:30 p.m. on June 5, 2015, when the Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York, went eerily silent. The kind of silence that only happens in prisons when something goes terribly wrong. Under the dim yellow floodlights, the ancient gray walls of the 19th century prison loomed like sleeping giants, unaware that two killers were about to make history. Inside cell block D, two men, Richard Matt and David Sweat, crouched near a hole carved neatly into the back of their cells. The air was thick with sweat and fear. The sound of dripping water echoed through the maze of pipes they had sawed open over weeks of secret labor. Richard Matt, 48, sharp-eyed, charismatic, a convicted murderer with an artist's hands and a predator's mind, looked at Sweat and whispered, "We're not coming back, kid." Moments later, they slid into the darkness, crawling through steel pipes slick with condensation, dragging their makeshift tools behind them. Somewhere above them, guards walked their rounds, unaware that the prison's most dangerous inmates were already ghosting beneath their feet. At 5:30 a.m., during morning roll call, an officer tapped on Matt's cell door and peered inside. "Matt. Sweat. Roll up." No answer. When the officer stepped in, he froze. On the bunk lay cleverly arranged dummies, layers of blankets and clothes mimicking sleeping bodies. Behind them, a hole. A black mouth gaping in the wall. The siren screamed. Every gate locked down. Searchlights flared. The great Clinton prison escape had begun. But how did two convicted killers pull off the most elaborate breakout in modern U.S. history? And more chillingly, how did a married prison employee become their secret accomplice? To understand that, we have to go back long before the hacksaw blades, the escape route, and the manhunt, back to when Joyce Mitchell first met the charming murderer who would change her life forever. Joyce Mitchell was, by all accounts, ordinary. A small-town woman from Dannemora, married, motherly, cheerful, and dependable. She'd worked in the prison's tailor shop for years, teaching inmates to sew uniforms. Her husband, Lyle Mitchell, also worked at the prison as a maintenance supervisor. The prison was their world, a fortress of concrete and steel nestled against the Adirondack Mountains. But behind those cold walls, routine had turned into a kind of numbness. For Joyce, life was repetitive: home, work, dinner, sleep, repeat. Until she met inmate 09A5822, Richard Matt. Richard was different. Unlike the other inmates who shuffled around with downcast eyes, Matt had a spark. He was polite, confident, and alarmingly charming. He painted portraits of prison staff, cracked jokes that made her blush, and complimented her hair. Little things. Innocent at first. But charm, in prison, is currency. And Matt spent it wisely. He learned her schedule. He noticed when she was stressed. He started calling her Tilly, her nickname, making her feel seen in a way her husband hadn't in years. Soon, their work conversations turned personal: her marriage troubles, her dreams of moving somewhere warm, her loneliness. Joyce was being groomed, and she didn't even see it happening. The relationship deepened inside the tailor shop, a place that smelled of fabric and machine oil, humming with the sound of sewing needles and whispers. There, under the fluorescent lights, she began slipping him small favors. Extra thread. Needles. Candy bars. Then it became smuggled tools, extra privileges, and eventually, trust. Matt didn't work alone. His younger cellmate, David Sweat, was quieter, more methodical. He had killed a sheriff's deputy years before and served life without parole. Together, they formed a deadly partnership. Sweat had the patience and precision, Matt had the charisma and manipulation. And Joyce Mitchell? She became their bridge to the outside world. She was the one who smuggled in hacksaw blades, chisels, and drill bits, often hidden inside frozen hamburger meat. On camera, the footage looked harmless: a factory worker bringing supplies to the shop. But behind the scenes, every item she carried was a piece of their freedom. When she wasn't working, she'd sit in her car outside the prison gates, smoking nervously, dreaming of running away. Matt had promised her a fantasy: escape, love, and a new life in Mexico. He told her she was beautiful. He said he'd protect her. She believed him. As weeks passed, the inmates worked tirelessly, cutting through walls and pipes hidden behind the cell's back panels. They mapped out their route through the catwalks, down the steam pipes, under the prison, and out through a manhole beyond the walls. Every night, they worked while the guards slept. The sound of sawing metal blended with the hum of the prison's heating system. No one noticed. Joyce became their lookout, their messenger, their lifeline. She provided blueprints, schedules, even baked goods with contraband inside. But as the plan neared completion, her nerves began to crack. She told Matt she couldn't do it anymore. Her husband was getting suspicious. She felt guilty. Matt reassured her, whispering in her ear during their secret meetings in the tailor shop, "We're almost free, Tilly. Just one last thing. You'll meet us outside that manhole, car running. Then it's just us and the open road." For weeks, she rehearsed the escape in her mind, the drive, the rendezvous point, the moment she'd leave her husband forever. But when the night finally came, Joyce broke. On June 5, the night of the escape, she suffered what she later described as a panic attack. Instead of waiting in her car, she went home, trembling, unable to face what she'd set in motion. That decision may have saved her life. When the sirens erupted the next morning, Joyce's world shattered. Her co-workers looked at her differently. Investigators arrived. She was questioned, then arrested. But by then, Richard, Matt and David Sweat were gone loose in the wild Adirondack forests. The manhunt that followed would become one of the largest in New York State history, helicopters circling, hundreds of officers combing through dense woods, checkpoints on every road. And as days turned into weeks, the story twisted from a prison escape into a national scandal, a tale of seduction, deceit, and death. Because this wasn't just a breakout. It was a betrayal fueled by passion, driven by manipulation, and destined for tragedy. By the time investigators pieced together the full story, the world had already made up its mind. Joyce Mitchell, the woman who risked everything for love, had become the face of a crime she couldn't control. But what no one knew yet was just how dangerous Richard Matt really was once he was free. Because out there, in the cold expanse of the Adirondacks, the killer who once painted portraits of guards was about to turn the forests into his new hunting ground. And the woman who helped him escape would soon realize she hadn't fallen in love with a man, she had fallen into the arms of a monster. Before he became a national headline, before the manhunt, before the charm that undid a woman's life, Richard Matt was already a storm in human form. He wasn't born evil, people say. But by the time he was a teenager, it was already too late. He grew up in Tonawanda, New York, a quiet industrial town outside Buffalo. His childhood wasn't extraordinary, just another working-class boy from a broken home. His father was a violent alcoholic, his mother distant, his home filled with shouting and neglect. As a boy, Matt learned one thing: if you couldn't control love, you could control fear. By age 13, he was already in juvenile detention. Theft. Assault. Breaking into houses for thrills. He wasn't stealing because he needed money, he was stealing because it made him feel powerful. In juvenile centers, he was the kid who could fight, who could talk, who could manipulate guards into giving him extra privileges. Even as a teenager, Richard Matt could read people like a map. In his early 20s, he graduated from petty crime to serious violence. He was handsome in a rough way, tall, dark hair, sharp eyes that could look kind one moment and cold the next. He could charm anyone, especially those who underestimated him. Then came the murder of William Rickerson, a Buffalo businessman who made the mistake of trusting him. In 1997, Matt, along with an accomplice, kidnapped Rickerson in a robbery gone wrong. They beat him mercilessly, demanding access to his bank account. But Matt wasn't just after money, he enjoyed control. Over 27 hours, they tortured Rickerson, moving him from location to location, before finally snapping his neck and dismembering his body. They stuffed his remains into a river. When he was captured in Mexico years later, after killing another man there, Matt bragged to other inmates about how he had watched the light leave Rickerson's eyes. It was a chilling confession, one that showed not just brutality, but pleasure. Even behind bars, Matt thrived in chaos. He painted portraits of celebrities, guards, and even prison administrators, often gifting them as tokens of respect. Those portraits earned him attention, special favors, and access. He wasn't just surviving prison, he was owning it. And that's where his real power lay. He studied guards, learned who was unhappy, who was lonely, who craved attention. When he met Joyce Mitchell, he saw not a prison worker, but an opportunity. A person with soft spots, someone who wanted to feel seen. Joyce wasn't Matt's first manipulation. Over the years, he had seduced and tricked multiple female employees, each believing they were special. But Joyce was different. She had the keys, the access, and most importantly, the emotional need he could exploit. By 2014, he was already drawing her into his orbit. He used his art to flatter her, sketches of flowers, small notes tucked into folded fabric, compliments whispered during work. He learned the details of her life, her dull marriage, her health issues, her longing to escape. And he gave her what she craved most, excitement. Prison is a dead world, gray and endless. But Matt made her feel alive even if it was inside a cage. He once told her, "You make this place feel less like hell." For a woman whose husband barely noticed her anymore, those words were intoxicating. Meanwhile, David Sweat, Matt's younger cellmate, was the opposite, quiet, methodical, almost shy. But he respected Matt. He saw in him the leadership he lacked. Together, they began sketching their dream, escape. But for Matt, it wasn't just about freedom. It was about control over the prison, over the system, over Joyce Mitchell. He told her things that sounded like love but were actually commands. "If you love me, you'll help me," he whispered. "If you want a better life, we'll make it happen together." Joyce started sneaking in small things, candy, tools, extra fabric. She justified it to herself as kindness, nothing more. But every act bound her closer to him. She was in deep, and she didn't even realize she'd crossed the line. Matt began sketching the escape route like an artist drawing his masterpiece. He and Sweat used contraband tools, hacksaw blades smuggled in through frozen meat packages. They cut holes behind their cell beds, leading to a maze of catwalks and pipes that few guards even knew existed. Night after night, they worked. The sound of metal scraping echoed softly behind the concrete walls, masked by the whir of fans and heating systems. By spring 2015, their plan was nearly ready. Matt told Joyce she'd be their getaway driver. He painted her a fantasy: they'd meet at a nearby intersection after dark, drive off to Mexico, and start new lives together. He told her he'd open a small shop, that he'd protect her. That he loved her. But underneath the romance was something darker. Matt's letters and whispers carried the weight of manipulation, not devotion. To him, Joyce was just another piece of the puzzle, a means to an end. Investigators would later find evidence that Matt was already planning to kill her once they escaped. He had told Sweat, "She's just a tool. Once we're out, we don't need her anymore." But Joyce didn't know that. All she saw was the promise of freedom and the man who said he'd give it to her. As the weeks counted down, tension grew. Guards began to suspect something was off. A few noticed Joyce's unusual closeness with the inmates. One even warned her husband, Lyle. But by then, she was too far gone, trapped in a web of lies and fantasies that had spun completely out of control. On the night of June 5, when the plan went into motion, Joyce was supposed to meet them in her car near a manhole outside the prison. The keys were ready. The route was planned. But fear took over. She froze. She couldn't do it. Matt and Sweat crawled through the tunnels without her, emerging into the cool night air, two shadows vanishing into the dark forests of northern New York. By morning, the manhunt had begun. But while the world searched for the fugitives, investigators turned their gaze to Joyce Mitchell, the woman who, driven by forbidden love and dangerous illusion, had helped a killer disappear. The irony was cruel. Matt had promised her freedom. Instead, she was now the one trapped inside a scandal that would destroy her life. And out in the woods, Richard Matt was no longer an inmate. He was a predator unleashed. At dawn on June 6, 2015, the town of Dannemora, New York, woke to a nightmare. Sirens screamed through the morning fog. Patrol cars flooded the narrow streets. Roadblocks snapped shut like jaws. Two convicted killers had vanished from one of the most secure prisons in the United States. The news spread fast. On local radio, a trembling voice announced. Two inmates, Richard Matt and David Sweat, have escaped from Clinton Correctional Facility. Citizens are advised to stay indoors and report any suspicious activity immediately. Within hours, hundreds of officers were mobilized. The New York State Police, U.S. Marshals, and Border Patrol agents fanned out across the Adirondack Mountains. Helicopters roared overhead. Dogs sniffed the underbrush. The governor, Andrew Cuomo, arrived at the prison himself. Cameras captured him stepping into the tunnel where the inmates had crawled out. "This was a movie plot," he said grimly. Except it was real. The entire region felt like a ghost town. Residents locked their doors, windows, and barns. Schools closed early. Hunting rifles came out of closets. The forests that once offered peace now looked sinister, miles of thick trees where anything could be hiding. And somewhere out there, Richard Matt and David Sweat were running. Their escape route was ingenious. They had climbed down through the prison's innards, pipes, tunnels, catwalks, following an old steam line that led under the walls. At the end of the tunnel, they cut through a steel pipe, crawled out through a manhole, and surfaced on the street just beyond the prison's north wall. It was like something out of the Shawshank Redemption, except this was real, and the men were killers. Their plan had been simple: Joyce Mitchell would be waiting in her car nearby. She'd drive them south, away from the border, where they'd hide out before heading for Mexico. But Joyce never showed. Standing in the cold darkness, Matt cursed under his breath. Sweat wanted to keep moving, but Matt insisted they wait. When dawn began to creep in, they realized they were on their own. They fled into the Adirondack wilderness, one of the most unforgiving terrains in the country. By the second day, the manhunt had turned into a military-scale operation. Tactical teams combed through every cabin and logging road. Snipers were stationed on ridges. Hundreds of officers trudged through swamps, armed with rifles and night vision goggles. The search was slow and brutal. Mosquitoes swarmed. Rain soaked equipment. The forests were dense, so thick that visibility dropped to a few feet. The sound of helicopters became a constant background hum. But Richard Matt thrived in chaos. He had lived as a fugitive before, surviving in Mexico, hustling for cash, charming strangers. Now, he slipped through the trees like a ghost, using old hunters' tricks to mask his scent and cover tracks. He and Sweat broke into remote cabins, stealing food, boots, maps, and even alcohol. In one cabin, investigators later found a half-empty bottle of gin and a pair of prison-issued underwear, the first clue they were still alive. As days passed, the escape captivated the nation. Media outlets camped outside Dannemora. Reporters swarmed locals with microphones. Every rumor became a headline: sightings of the fugitives from Vermont to Canada. But the longer they were out there, the more dangerous they became. Richard Matt was deteriorating. The cold nights and endless hunger wore on him, but it was the alcohol withdrawal that pushed him toward madness. Witnesses later described him as increasingly erratic, paranoid, aggressive, unpredictable. He began talking about splitting from Sweat. "I don't need anyone," he growled one night, pacing by a small fire in the woods. Sweat tried to calm him, but Matt's temper flared. The partnership that had built their escape was beginning to fracture. Meanwhile, back at the prison, security flaws were exposed: outdated infrastructure, overworked staff, blind spots. Clinton Correctional wasn't just a prison anymore, it was a symbol of how neglect and human weakness could build the perfect storm. And in that storm, Richard Matt was still out there, armed and desperate. By the second week, morale among search teams began to wane. The forests were massive, the terrain punishing. Every rustle in the leaves could have been a squirrel or a killer. Then, one night, a Border Patrol agent found footprints near a remote cabin. Inside, they discovered candy wrappers, boots, and a map torn from a road atlas. The scent dogs picked up a trail. The hunt reignited. Helicopters thundered overhead. Spotlights sliced through the treetops. Officers advanced slowly, rifles raised. Richard Matt was only a few miles ahead, hiding near a creek. His health was failing, he had blisters on his feet, infected cuts on his legs, and barely any food left. But he still carried a shotgun stolen from a hunting cabin. To survive, he drank rainwater and raw whiskey stolen from cabins. The man who once painted portraits and flirted with guards was now reduced to a trembling fugitive with bloodshot eyes and cracked lips. Sweat tried to convince him to keep moving north toward the Canadian border, but Matt refused. "I'm not running anymore," he said. "I'm fighting." On June 26, 21 days after the escape, a patrol team near Malone, New York, heard something, a cough, faint but human. They paused, rifles raised. Then, a single shot rang out. The officers hit the ground, returning fire toward the sound. When the dust settled, they found Richard Matt lying face down in the grass, a bullet wound through his head. A 12-gauge shotgun lay beside him. He had fired first. The officers fired back. It was over. Richard Matt, the artist, the manipulator, the murderer, was dead at 49. But one question remained: where was David Sweat? He was still out there, somewhere in the woods. Tired. Alone. And running for his life. With Matt gone, Sweat was alone and on the move. He headed south, hoping to reach the Canadian border on foot. He was exhausted but disciplined, surviving on rainwater and stolen food. On June 28, 2 days after Matt's death, State Police Sergeant Jay Cook was patrolling near Constable, New York, when he spotted a lone man walking along a road. Something about the man's gait caught his attention. Cook stopped, stepped out of his patrol car, and called out, "Hey! Come here!" Sweat turned and bolted for the tree line. Cook chased him across an open field, shouting for him to stop. When Sweat ignored the warnings and reached for his waistband, Cook fired twice. Sweat fell, bleeding but alive. He was captured after 22 days on the run, dirty, skeletal, and silent. The capture of David Sweat ended a manhunt that had cost the state of New York over $23 million. It involved nearly 1,500 officers and stretched across rural communities for hundreds of miles. Sweat was hospitalized, then returned to custody under maximum security. During questioning, he confirmed that Joyce Mitchell had been their inside contact and that without her, none of it would have been possible. Mitchell later pled guilty to promoting prison contraband and criminal facilitation, serving several years behind bars. The scandal triggered sweeping reforms in New York's prison system, increased surveillance, tighter staff screening, and major overhauls in security protocols. To this day, the story of Richard Matt and David Sweat remains one of the most infamous prison escapes in modern American history. It exposed vulnerabilities in a system that was supposed to be airtight and revealed how emotions, manipulation, and misplaced trust could unravel even the most fortified institution. Joyce Mitchell's name became synonymous with betrayal. Matt's death was a grim reminder of how power and charisma could destroy lives. And Sweat's survival served as a haunting testimony to human endurance and the desperate will to be free, no matter the cost. The clang of the prison gates at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility echoed like a final judgment. Joyce Mitchell, once a friendly seamstress and wife, walked in wearing a beige prison uniform, the same system she had once served, now holding her captive. She had gone from trusted staff member to national disgrace. The woman who once smiled behind the tailor shop counter was now the subject of every headline, every late-night talk show punchline. The prison guard of desire. The woman who helped a killer escape. But beneath the scandal, behind the bars and flashing cameras, was a story that went deeper, one of loneliness, manipulation, and irreversible choices. In the interrogation room, Joyce sat hunched over the table, her fingers trembling. For hours, detectives had pressed her, and finally, she broke. "I know what I did was wrong," she whispered. "He made me feel loved. I thought he cared about me." Her eyes were red, swollen from days without sleep. She confessed everything: the smuggled hacksaw blades, the coded love notes, the secret plans. She admitted she was supposed to pick up Matt and Sweat after their escape, drive them to a cabin, then cross into Mexico together. But guilt and fear of her husband discovering the affair stopped her. "I couldn't go through with it," she said quietly. "I froze." Joyce Mitchell's trial became a national spectacle. The courtroom was packed, reporters, cameras, curious locals. She stood before the judge, head bowed, as prosecutors painted her as the ultimate betrayer, a woman who put her emotions above duty, risking hundreds of lives for a fantasy. But her defense told another story of emotional manipulation and psychological control. Richard Matt, they argued, was a master manipulator. A man who could charm anyone. He used her weakness against her, the defense said. He made her believe she was saving him when in reality, she was destroying herself. In the end, Joyce pled guilty to promoting prison contraband and criminal facilitation. She was sentenced to 2.5 to 7 years in prison. As the judge read her sentence, Joyce stared at the floor. There were no tears, only silence. Behind bars, Joyce was no longer in control. Gone were the friendly greetings from inmates who once trusted her. Now, she was just another number, another story whispered through cell bars. Inmates mocked her, some pitied her. She threw her life away for a man who didn't love her, one inmate told reporters later. Joyce spent her days sewing uniforms and keeping to herself. Her letters were monitored, her movements tracked. Every echo of the door closing reminded her of what she had lost: her freedom, her family, her reputation. Her husband, Lyle Mitchell, initially stood by her. He told the press, "She made a mistake, but she's still my wife." But even he couldn't erase the betrayal that had shaken their lives. Years later, Joyce admitted in an interview, "I was a coward. I thought I was in love, but it was all lies. I ruined everything for nothing." The Clinton Correctional Facility faced the biggest reckoning in its history. An internal investigation uncovered a series of systemic failures, unsearched packages, ignored red flags, and an over-familiar staff culture. Several officers were suspended or reassigned. Security policies were rewritten. Cameras were added. Every door, every corridor, every staff relationship was scrutinized. Governor Andrew Cuomo called it a wake-up call for the entire correctional system. The escape didn't just expose two criminals, it exposed a broken structure, one built on routine, trust, and complacency. Richard Matt's story ended in gunfire, his name etched into history as a charming killer who couldn't resist control even when it cost him his life. David Sweat survived, but his freedom lasted only 22 days. In interviews from his cell, he described Matt as reckless, unpredictable, and dangerous. "I had to get away from him," Sweat said. "He was going to get us both killed." Sweat was transferred to 5 Points Correctional Facility, one of the most secure prisons in New York. He spends 23 hours a day in his cell, no visitors, no luxuries, no contact. He has often reflected on the escape, saying, "I thought I wanted freedom. But freedom didn't want me." For the residents of Dannemora, life returned to normal, but the scars remained. For weeks, the woods around their homes had been crawling with armed officers. Helicopters had thundered overhead, checkpoints had blocked their roads, and fear had crept into every quiet night. It became a story parents told their children: "Don't trust appearances. Even killers can smile." For Joyce, the true punishment wasn't her prison sentence, it was living with what she had done. Every night, she replayed the same memories: Richard's smirk, his soft words, the promises that vanished the moment he crawled through that pipe and left her behind. She had believed she was running toward love. But in truth, she was only running away from herself. After serving her time, Joyce Mitchell walked out of prison in 2020. She avoided cameras, kept her head down, and tried to rebuild a quiet life. She declined most interviews, but in one short statement to the press, she said, "I'll regret what I did for the rest of my life. It wasn't love, it was manipulation. And it destroyed everything I cared about." Her story became a cautionary tale, not just about crime, but about vulnerability and the dangerous power of persuasion. When the walls of Clinton Correctional were rebuilt and the headlines faded, one truth remained: love and obsession can be as deadly as any weapon. Richard Matt used words sharper than the hacksaw blades he hid inside hamburger meat. Joyce Mitchell traded her freedom for a fantasy. David Sweat ran for the horizon only to find himself caged once more. In the end, all three became prisoners, not of the system, but of their own choices. If you've made it this far into the story, you've just witnessed one of the most unbelievable true prison break tales in modern history, a story of lust, betrayal, and the kind of obsession that turns ordinary people into accomplices of chaos. It's a reminder that the most dangerous prisons aren't always made of bars and steel, sometimes, they're built inside the human heart. If you found this story gripping, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, because there are more real-life stories just like this one, stories that prove truth can be darker than fiction. And before you go, share this video with someone who loves true crime. Because you never know, the next story might be happening closer than you think.